depending on the time zone to everyone, and thanks for attending and joining this webinar. We're very happy to have today with us Professor Michelle Buckley and Professor Glenn Brown. They are both based in the Department of Human Geography at the University of Toronto, at the Scarborough, if I pronounce it well, campus. They have been working collaboratively on a very interesting and very innovative research looking at the gentrification process. Sorry, before I delve into the topic, I have to, it's just a formal statement because we have to alert everyone that we are recording this seminar. So you can, if you don't want to be recorded, you can attend the seminar also from our Facebook page. This is just a standard message that we offer. So, as I was saying, this would be a very interesting seminar on gentrification processes based on home renovations in Toronto. I think the city of Toronto is very interesting because it's in North America, but it's not the United States. So it offers, it has many similarities with what we read about US. There is a lot of literature and scholarship in urban studies and geography on US cities, of course also on Canadian cities, but Canadian cities have their own specific aspects, specific issues. And Toronto itself, I was reading an interesting journal article, a city profile, appeared in Cities in 2015, which was highlighting how the Toronto shifted from a reputation as a problem-solving city in the early 90s to an increasingly more polarized and divided city in the 2000s, when it started adopting neoliberal policies and it started being more closely related to economic globalization. So economic globalization brought about many economic opportunities, perhaps, but also many social-spatial contradictions, and including the process of gentrification we will focus on today. Still, this article by Megan Joy and Ronald Vogel pointed out that Toronto was described by The Economist and the influential British weekly magazine as in 2015 as the best place to live in the world. So we have social spatial division, inequalities, but there is also an allegedly very high quality of living for whom, for some portions of the urban population, at least for the most privileged parts of the urban population. So I will leave the floor now to Michelle and Glenn for the presentation. Usually the rule of the game is that we give you approximately 50 minutes for if you feel comfortable with this length for your speech, for your talk. And then we will have a short break, and then we will have a discussion time.
Great.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Thanks for again for coming and please.
Wonderful.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yes, thank you. Why don't I start by sharing my screen here, and you can let me know if you can see it. Is that working? Yes, that's working. Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Ugo, for that lovely introduction, and thank you everyone for being here. It is a strange day to be doing this talk, in part because we're having an election to our very large neighbor to the south of us, as some of you may be keeping track of. And so it's been a very busy morning here, just listening to the news and everything. But we're just so pleased to be here. Thank you to Ugo for inviting us. Thank you also to Margarita and all of the team at the Institute for arranging for us to join you via Zoom. We're really honored and really happy to be able to share some of our work with you, but we're also really excited to engage with you and to hear some of the discussion in the Q&A. So our talk today is entitled Gentrification Brick by Brick, which is more of a question for us right now: home renovations and the transformation of Toronto's low-rise housing stock. And what I'll do is I'll start off the presentation, and then my colleague Glenn will take over, and we'll kind of go back and forth a little bit. Just to give you a little bit of an outline, what we'll do is we'll start by giving you a bit of an introduction and an overview of the project. We'll outline our research questions and our methods, and Glenn will help very much with that as he's the methods expert here. We're going to go through 3 objectives of the project. And one caveat to this is that this project is actually still underway. So if you're amenable and if you might humor us, we don't have necessarily a fully fleshed out set of arguments quite yet. We have some preliminary findings and some preliminary arguments. But what we wanted to do was to show you a project that's very much alive right now and very much underway, in part because we would love to engage you in some of the sort of directions in which we're going and get your sense and your ideas and perhaps your feedback on what we are both doing with this project, but also where we think we may go with it. So it's perhaps a little bit different than some other sort of fully realized and congealed projects that you may have seen in this seminar series. We hope that it will be a kind of dynamic and generative discussion. So we'll show you our preliminary findings and future directions. So one caveat is that it's still underway. The second caveat is, in fact, that I am, this is a project about open data, big data, and also GIS methods. I must confess at the beginning of this that I am not a GIS scholar. I'm actually a qualitative geographer. And so for me, Glenn is a GIS expert, and he really is the expert on sort of the methods and the methodology of this project. But I am, most of my background is in qualitative methods. And so this project, for me at least, was a moment to think about how big data is used, but also what the role of collaborations between qualitative and quantitative geographers might be in this moment. And also as a kind of opportunity for me to expand my own methodological horizons as a scholar. So I may not be able to answer all of your questions. Glenn can probably answer a lot of your questions. We will do our best. But that's just the caveat that I approach this project more than any of my other work as much more of a student, both of gentrification debates, but also of the sort of the use of GIS as a tool for visualizing what's happening in cities. So with those caveats in mind, research in the past few decades in Toronto, some of you who may be familiar with the Toronto context, and I hope we'll give enough background and context for those of you who are not familiar with Toronto and what's been happening there in terms of development. In the past few decades, there's been an absolute, a wonderful and exciting growth of research by scholars interested in the production of new residential spaces in Toronto. And they have very rightly focused, in many cases, since the late 1990s and early 2000s, on documenting what Gilad Rosen and Alan Wachs have called the rise of condoism. So in Toronto, over the past 20 years, there's been an absolute explosion of high-rise and mid-rise condominium buildings. In some cases, we'll show you maps of Toronto in a little bit, but in some cases, all along the waterfront and along some of Toronto's brownfields, so underused or industrial areas, but all along transit corridors and elsewhere. And so scholars have really sought to map and understand the rise of condo living in the city. It has had among the fastest rates of development and condominium growth across North America in recent decades. It has outstripped many of the largest urban centers in the United States. And so part of what scholars sought to do was to point to the vast production of new residential spaces through condominium development, but also to point to condo growth as key drivers in the gentrification of the downtown core. So in a sense, in the displacement of less affluent residents and the influx of young professionals, but also more affluent residents into what had previously been working class and poor areas of the downtown core. They had also pointed to the growth of condo living as a particular form of privatized governance. This is Alan Walks, my wonderful colleague, our wonderful colleague, Alan Walks at the University of Toronto's work has really looked at this. As they note, condo tenure is different than homeownership and tends to foster new forms of sort of new lifestyles in the downtown core, but also, in a sense, new forms of urban governance through what are ostensibly privatized buildings. As August and Walks note, the enormous rise in these condo towers, which are really, you can't ignore them in the downtown core, has been accompanied by a real drop-off and a fall in the development of low-rise, so 2- and 3-story single-family homes. So there's been very little construction of new homes, low-rise homes in Toronto, as we have seen the growth of condo living. And part of this is because in the 1980s and 1990s in Canada, there was a housing crash and a mortgage crisis of skyrocketing interest rates that really caused the low-rise house building industry to crash, but also to move out to the suburbs around Toronto, to places like Markham and Brampton, where land was not only cheaper, but development rules made it slightly easier and more attractive to large home builders to build new homes. But anyone walking through the downtown core of Toronto in recent years, and particularly in neighborhoods with low-rise housing, and there are vast swaths of inner core parts of the city that really are peppered with mainly, almost exclusively in some cases, homes that are really detached or row houses that are about 2 or 3 stories. You might have seen something that looks like this. And this you'll see at the top here is really an addition perched atop, probably a home that's about 80 to 100 years old. And that is a 3rd floor that someone's putting on the top of that. Now, I'm primarily a scholar whose work has been focused on the precarious forms of work and employment in the construction trades, but also in the home renovation sector that produce these kinds of additions. And that work has really pointed to the racialized and hierarchies of labor that low-rise home renovations relies on. In a lot of cases, cheap labor that makes these kinds of renovations more affordable for individual homeowners. And part of how I came to this project was through previous research that had looked at and mapped, in a sense, these informal labor markets and the wages and the kinds of employment dynamics that had been a part of this renovation sector. And one of the arguments that I made at that point, which is a research that finished up in a couple of years ago, was that amidst steeply rising home values and levels of household mortgage debt, renovation has been a kind of labored fix for a number of Torontonians who would like to have a nicer home or a bigger home, but can't necessarily afford to. So I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. So we've seen additions like this, but we've also seen quite a bit of this. So if you walk around the downtown core of Toronto, you'll see dumpsters like this, full of dirt from people underpinning or digging out their basements. So these are very common sights in much of the sort of downtown core. So the growth of renovations over the last 20 years and the interest by private homeowners, low-rise homeowners and renovations over the last 20 years is very much connected to the affordability of mortgage debt and the rise in housing prices in Toronto during this time. So as we've seen an enormous explosion in condominium development, we've also seen enormous demand for and speculative investment in the housing stock in Toronto. And as a result, we have seen prices rise precipitously, particularly over the last 10 years. Interest rates for mortgage debt in Canada have been at almost all-time lows over the past 2 decades. And this has spurred and facilitated a lot of housing purchases. In part, this has been a deliberate move by the government and the Bank of Canada to encourage homeownership, both housing exchange, but also rising levels of people in Canada who are actual homeowners versus renters. Because homeownership is in Canada one of the principal means of wealth building for households across the country. Since the new millennium, the results of cheap debt have been in some ways a huge boon for homeowners. So more affordable mortgage rates have fueled house buying, which has led also to rising house prices that have generated about 1.8 trillion Canadian dollars in new household wealth since 2000. So while homeowners in Canada may not have seen their incomes go up in the last 20 years very much, although it depends on the sector, of course, many who are homeowners have become quite house rich. And these relate to what Alan Walks and other scholars have called asset welfare, which refers to the key place that homeowning plays in Canada as a retirement, but also a social reproductive safety net in our economy. So more and more homeownership and the equity in homeownership has been used. For example, if you draw on that equity, you can smooth over consumption needs, right? The need for big purchases or for unemployment. The home has become, in effect, a privatized and individualized safety net, as we've also seen the state retreat from particular forms of social welfare. However, while this has been a boon to some homeowners, cheap debt and the incentives to own have indeed helped more people become homeowners in the last decade, but these incentives have also produced, at least in Toronto, very acute crisis dynamics. So housing prices have skyrocketed in the last decade, but also across neighboring municipalities such as Markham, Mississauga, Brampton, and Oshawa. Household mortgage debt has also risen to very alarming levels, in fact, all across Canada. So a few years ago, the national average household debt, which is dominated by, in a lot of cases, by mortgage debt, reached about 150% of household income. So for every dollar a Canadian household makes, it owes about $1.50 in debt. In Toronto, these dynamics are much more pernicious. So the numbers have probably risen now, but in 2016, roughly 40% of borrowers in Toronto carried mortgage debt worth 450% of what they made annually. So $4.50 in debt for every dollar that they actually earned. And until recently, the availability of cheap mortgage debt, so very low, there were low down payments. It was easy to get a rate that was easy to service. You didn't have to pay as much in interest. Is a key reason why home buyers in the region have been able to afford homes, but it's also exactly part of the dynamic that's made homes more expensive for so many. So there are large portions of, say, millennials in Toronto and other, single-headed families for whom homeownership is now well out of reach. And this is an absolute crisis of affordability in our city. So one of the consequences of rising mortgage debt and rising house prices has at least interesting to me, I hope, and I'm sure interesting to Glenn, has been, in fact, as I mentioned earlier, an explosion in home renovations. And in Toronto, this is in part because many homeowners who may, have growing families, or who may even have millennial children who need to move back home because they can't afford the rents, can't necessarily afford to move into a bigger house. And so what they've chosen to do is, instead of moving, what we call here in Toronto is moving up the property ladder by buying a more expensive asset. That's one of the ways that homeowners build wealth, is to not only sit on your home and wait for its value to appreciate, but to exchange your home for a more expensive one and sort of move up the ladder to better assets, is that they've actually chosen to keep their property off the market and instead renovate it. In some cases, renovating it quite substantially. So many homeowners have chosen to do that. And in fact, as of 2014, for the first time ever, homeowners across Canada, in fact, began to spend more money on renovations than they actually spent on buying homes. And that, to me, as a geographer who studies the production of the built environment and the labor that produces, particularly residential assets, was very, very interesting. I've previously written about this in economic geography, framing the explosion as I said, as a kind of labor-intensive spatial fix for the unaffordability crisis. And this rallied huge numbers of both informal sector and formal sector renovators, and basically employs 800,000 formal sector workers across the country, and far more if we actually count those who are informally employed as renovators and involved in demolition and so on. So the very same dynamics of renovation that have allowed some homeowners to build asset wealth and create the home that they want if they can't afford to move, as some gentrification scholars know all too well, it has actually made the affordability crisis worse, because fewer homes have been on the market, and so that's driven up prices further. But also there's been evidence that some of these renovations are really transforming the housing stock, so taking smaller houses and making them much bigger, or tearing down houses and building monster homes, are just two of the sort of very extreme examples of this. So Glenn and I had been talking about some of these dynamics, and we had come across the City of Toronto's open data portal. And the data portal is an initiative launched by the City of Toronto several years ago, in which they've taken a lot of their public data, so everything from council meetings to rezoning applications, but also building permits, which are public. Anyone who files for a building permit on any kind of structure, that's actually public. That's public data that anyone can go and search. Previously, it was data that you had to go in person to search, but now it's all online through the open data portal. And they've now published every single building permit for anything from restaurant renovations to industrial park development, but also residential renovations. And everything is actually online as of 2001. So for me as a scholar, this project to take this building permit and see what we could do with it arose as somebody who had previously been looking at the labor markets of home renovation. But Glenn came to this research as a GIS scholar and a cartographer with an interest in open data, who was actually fairly new to Toronto when we started this project a year or two ago. And the permits data and the prospect of developing them seemed like an excellent opportunity for Glenn, who conducts research, but also whose work at the Scarborough campus is very focused on teaching and developing our GIS program, which under his very sure leadership has blossomed and really just grown so fast. And as he's led the growth of that program, this open data portal and the building permit data seemed like an excellent opportunity to learn about an aspect of Toronto through mapping, while also involving students in research and in the creation of a data source that could be used to create experiential learning exercises for our undergraduates with observation points throughout the city. And Glenn's going to talk a little bit about that aspect of the project in a little bit. So this was exciting to both of us, but for in some ways, very different reasons. And it was exciting because one of the questions arising from my previous research was, while so much attention has been paid to the explosion of condominiums, I was wondering, as I was watching and doing research with a lot of the men doing work in the renovation sector, and seeing the extraordinary change in some of our low-rise housing stock, was to what extent are individual homeowners aggregately transforming the low-rise housing stock in Toronto? And was it possible to aggregate some of these granular kinds of individual and almost private homeownership decisions together and to create some kind of a visual picture? The investment decisions of private homeowners relative to developers are often quite opaque. You know, the home is often considered a very private economy. And yet here we have this public data set that actually brought all of these individual homeowner decisions, these private household decisions to the fore. So some of our questions were to kind of mirror some of the questions that condo researchers had asked, which was, you know, how many owners have actually added space to their homes in recent decades? Has there been a kind of attendant production of space in the low-rise housing stock? What form has this taken? And where has it been occurring in the city over time? Some of these can be very difficult to visualize, but we thought that these were interesting. You know, renovations in gentrification scholarship, particularly in the 60s and the 70s, from what I understand, renovations has been very empirically central. So more affluent homeowners would, move into a neighborhood. They would undertake sweat equity, you know, their own work to sort of revitalize and rehabilitate old properties and to increase their value. Those increasing values would often, as the sort of theory or the story would go, would often push out poor, but also racialized and other less affluent groups in the city. But at this current moment in which financialized homeownership and high levels of mortgage debt are really creating a churn in the renovations market, we wondered if this was a really important moment to revisit this question of renovations, both conceptually and theoretically. So as I said, we draw on some of the literature from asset welfare, which really centers and understands the centrality of homeownership in Canada's political economy. We were curious about some of the research on housing as a fictitious commodity and solely as a fictitious commodity, but we had also started to read through some of the gentrification scholarship, which was looking specifically at housing renovations in the current moment and thinking about their effects on neighborhood change and on housing values. So those are just some of the literatures that Glenn and I are students of at this moment. So in looking to explore who's producing new space, additional space in their homes, we decided to focus quite narrowly. So this is not a full picture that we're going to show you today. We decided to look at two different kinds of ways of adding space. The first on your left is what scholars like Schwetz and others have called pop-ups and pop-outs. So third floor additions, as you'll see at the top here, which add a full floor of residential space to what you can see is actually probably a home that's got to be, could be between 50 to 100 years old. And then pop outs. So in a lot of cases, people are using relatively small downtown lots to demolish their decks and put on a back addition. And the other one, so those are actually captured by the building permit data that we saw. The other one is what we might call basement underpinnings. So what a lot of Toronto homeowners, particularly of older housing stock, they have these basements that are, maybe 6 or 7 feet. They were mostly crawl spaces or sort of, storage spaces which were really just the foundations of the buildings. And so what they've done is they've actually dig out the basement and take out a huge amount of earth, and then they underpin the foundations so that what was a 6-foot floor to ceiling actually becomes a 9 or 10 foot in some cases. And you end up with an entire new livable, effectively another floor of livable space that can be turned into rec rooms or basement apartments for generating income. And we looked at that in part because the permit data a lot of the building permit data may not cover some renovations that homeowners are doing. I think there are other things that certainly add value to the house. But these two are very hard to hide from permit officers. It's very hard to put an addition, a third floor addition on your home without having inspectors come by and making you get a building permit. So we thought that this would be quite accurately captured by the data. So that's one of the reasons we chose it. But also these are two of the sort of most substantial ways of making new space in your home and turning what might be a 2-bedroom house, which would be like an entry-level house for people trying to get on the property ladder, suddenly into a very expensive asset, a 4 or 5-bedroom house that can add tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars to the actual resale value of the house. So those are the two that we looked at, and I'm going to turn it over to Glenn now, who's going to explain in a little more detail some of our methodology. Glenn?
Thanks, Michelle. So, as Michelle has explained, we've been looking for specific types of residential renovations. Just to back up from that a little bit, what we've been dealing with here. So the data that we got from the city is in the form of Excel spreadsheets that contain all of the building permits that have been, the term is cleared in any given year. So when we were doing this 2 years ago and into last year, we basically went through all of the years from 2001, the first available, until 2018. And in each case, we would have a spreadsheet that would show all of the cleared permits that were cleared that year. So cleared can include permits that were closed, which is the biggest group of them. A closed permit means that the work has been completed and it's been inspected, and then the permit gets closed. Otherwise, permits could be canceled, for whatever reason, the work was not carried out. Permits can be superseded, but the largest bulk of them in any given year are the closed permits that say this work was done and it was inspected. These files, as Michelle said, contain all of the permits cleared in that year for all types of buildings, whether they're commercial buildings, high-rise apartments, as well as the residential spaces that we're interested in. So there was a certain amount of filtering that we had to do to get down to a subset of permits that we thought were interesting for what we're looking for. Again, underpinnings and residential additions. So we ended up going through a process which involved both automated filtering and manual coding of permit records. So to start off, in the summer of 2018 and into in the fall and winter 2018 to 2019, Michelle and I started working with 2 undergrad RAs, and we sort of worked through a process of trying to figure out how we could automate some of the filtering to basically throw away big chunks of these permits that we were pretty sure were not of interest to us without losing too many permits that actually might be of interest to us. So we went through the process of coding, filtering based on structure types, work type, and then just pattern matching on the text. As I'll show you in a minute, each of these records contains a textual description field, which is a description of the work that's going on, and it's in various formats. So automated filtering of that too much was kind of difficult, but we could pick out certain things that would probably be keys to us to say, this record might be interesting. And so with the work that we did with those students, we went through 1 year of permits with those 2 students and tried various approaches to filtering all that data. With that, we went last year then and worked with a group of 4 undergrad students. We basically applied some course automated filtering using OpenRefine to all of these data sets. And basically I quickly applied this open refine filtering to create for each year a filtered data set, which kind of looked like the output from the first year of work that we did with the 2 students. As part of that work, we had learned a couple of lessons. One was there is a way to automatically filter this to get at least a rough estimate of the permits we want to see. We also learned that we needed to have some quality assurance process in place so that if I give an undergrad student an Excel sheet containing 50,000 permit records, and they go and work on that for 40 hours, 50 hours, and come back to me, I have to be able to check to make sure that records in that Excel sheet haven't been mangled, corrupted, because we did have a couple of cases where students were using things like Excel online, as well as copying files back and forth on USB keys, where files did come back looking a little bit weird. So I put some scripts in place that allowed us to actually rematch what of that data was actually okay and which pieces had to be redone. To give you an idea of the numbers here, across those 18 years, 2001 to 2018, these Excel files contain about 550,000 permit records that have been closed. And so we've gone through this now, basically given each of these Excel sheets to 1 or 2 students. They've gone through manually coded based on the descriptions to look through and figure out whether these records look like they're an addition of space, underpinnings, additions, converting garage space. There's a number of different categories that we looked at and said, okay, those are interesting to us. And then they would manually code those. Once they had given them back to me and I'd gone through the quality assurance process, then I would actually take their records and upload that into an online database. So we now have an online database containing 550,000 permit records. And that's what we're using now for sort of ongoing analysis and visualization work. And the ongoing questions that we're starting to ask now is based on that database, which does a couple of things. And I'll explain this more in a little bit as we start to look at the structure of the permit records themselves. Could we go to the next slide, please, Michelle? Thank you. So to give you an idea what these permit records look like, here we have a group of 7 building permit records. And I'll show you in a minute sort of why these are grouped as an interesting group of 7, but essentially these all relate to the same address. They have a base permit number, which is common across all of them. So this is the kind of thing that we're dealing with when we're looking at these building permits. In this case, this is a set of 7 permit records. Yeah, that's fine if you want to go to that next slide. Thanks, Michelle. This is a group of 7 permit records that all relate to a single renovation on one residential building. And what happens over time is you might get multiple revisions that sort of modify what was originally planned. There are permits that relate to the actual construction, the building itself. There are ones that relate to actually putting in sewer drains, ones that relate to doing the heating and ventilation systems for those buildings. And these all come out as separate permits, but really this is all one project. So we started with this group of records, and we would filter through to figure out, is each one of these records something that we even want to look at? So first of all, on structure type, basically we were looking for a couple of keywords, but SFD stands for a single family dwelling. So that's one that we wanted to look at for the subset we were interested in. We're looking at the status. These are all closed records, so those are interesting to us if they haven't been canceled. This was work that was actually done and inspected. And then we would just go through the second line in each of these records is showing the description of the work that was done. And so there we would pick out some keywords: alterations, additions, basements, garages. In some cases, people are converting existing garages into habitable space. So these are all keywords that we would filter out to say, okay, these are a set of records that we actually want to have our students look at. Can we go to the next one? Thank you. So here you can see now that in the coded column, one of our students has gone through and added an A to a couple of these records to say, okay, this looks like an addition. And the keywords in the description that would have triggered them to do that. In one case, it was a basement underpinning. So that's adding space inside the house by lifting the whole house up and building a lower floor. In the other one, it's converting an existing attached garage to habitable space. So our students would have manually coded these as additions by putting an A in the coded column. Next, please. And then finally, we would get down to trying to figure out, okay, so we've got 550,000 permits, but what we're actually interested in trying to understand is the residential addition projects. How we want to talk about projects. So in order to do that, we've done some work where we've basically gone through and regrouped all of these records now by lopping off the codes at the end of the permit numbers that designate different kind of work, whether it's the building construction itself or the heating and ventilation system. And we've grouped all of these records according to just the root of the permit number. So in this case, we would collapse all 7 of these records into a single project. Next slide, please. And then we would create a summary of that project. And the way we did that was by essentially taking the permit number without the trailing information to characterize the project. You know, we're interested in things like, when did this project happen? So we would take the earliest of all the application dates. So in this case, you can see that application dates ranged between July of 2010 to July of 2011. And we would take the latest of the completion dates. So the earliest completion dates were 2012, but the latest of the completion dates was 2018. So we would characterize this as being a project which ran essentially from 2010 to 2018. It's closed, and we would take the greatest of the residential space values. I haven't talked about these yet, but the residential space values in the case of additions give us the amount of living space that was added to the building in square meters. So this is an interesting project in that it's both doing basement underpinning and it's converted a garage to habitable space. And yet this residential value is saying that there was 0 living space added. So there are cases like this where it's still a bit of an interpretive job to figure out, okay, what exactly does this mean? So we would decide that we've decided that we're interested in this record because it's a project that clearly is adding habitable space, but there's something funny going on in the data in terms of it doesn't actually record how much living space is there. And we've been told this residential space value is inspected and verified in these permits. So we've been generally told to trust these residential living increase values, but this one looks a little bit weird. And that just gives you an idea of sort of the process we've gone through, as well as the type of data we're dealing with, as well as the fact that we're dealing with some quantitative data in these records, but we're also actually picking through qualitative data in terms of the residential, the project descriptions to try and figure out what is actually going on here. What kind of project is this? I'll leave it at that for now. Thanks, Michelle.
Wonderful. Thanks, Glenn. I'm cognizant of time, so I'm going to go through the next few slides a little bit fast, but we certainly can come back to them in the question and answer. So just to kind of step back for a moment, as this project has moved forward, certainly the empirical research of what we can glean from these permits has been front and center, and we're going to be focusing on those in the remaining slides. But as Glenn said, you know, this project has actually become kind of 3-pronged. The first is the research. The second is the learning resource, the database that has come out of this that Glenn has developed for students in our undergraduate program. And the third, which I'll talk about only very briefly, are the public applications of making this data visible. Because as you can see, when the public data, the open data, might be open to the public, but it's not necessarily accessible to the public in these giant CSV files. So we've been starting to think about the kinds of tools that we can create that would allow people to see what renovations and building permits are being applied for in their own neighborhoods. And you can see there's the link to the open data site. So I'll move on in the last little while to talk a little bit about some of the key findings. And Glenn, maybe you can briefly talk a little bit about the resource that you've created for our students. This is one of the first preliminary findings. So in looking at all of that data, those 500,000 permits that we filtered for additions and additional space, one of the things we found was that the number of permits for additions and underpinnings over the past 20 years or so, or 17 years, I suppose, has roughly doubled. So there's been a doubling of the number of people who are seeking to add space to their homes. And that you will see in the orange line there. It has moved from about 669 permits completed in 2001 to about 1,257 completed in 2018. And in terms of the total, the blue bars that you'll see is actually the total addition of space that has been added through these kinds of additions. These projects have added roughly in the last 17 years about 1.2 million square meters of space to the low-rise housing stock, that's about 13.2 million square feet. And to put that into context, that is about the equivalent of building 10,000 new houses in the downtown core. So it's not insignificant. If that were to happen, that would vastly change the housing market in the downtown. But it is still small compared to the number of dwellings overall. That's only about 5% or so of the dwellings, of the low-rise dwellings in the city of Toronto have actually had these kinds of additions. And with respect to the amount of condo space added, it's a drop in the bucket. But as you'll see, I do think that because there's such a limited low-rise housing stock, and because the housing market is so focused on people buying condos and then trying to buy a house, this has probably made a lot of what would have been entry-level houses that would have been first-time home buyer, like low-rise house buyers, are now out of reach. So it's actually quite, I would argue, is quite substantial. The other thing I'm going to show you right now is, so because I am such a layperson when it comes to GIS, Glenn has brilliantly created a tool in part to make it legible to me, but what he's created is actually a map. And I'll just bear with me here. I'm probably the least tech savvy person in the room, and I've got control of the share screen here, so just humor me. One of the things that Glenn did was to create a kind of interactive online map, and we can put the link. I don't know, Glenn, do you want to put, I don't know if we can use the chat, but you can put the link in the chat if people want to play around with it.
Yeah, I'll put it up.
That'd be great. And what he's done is he's actually created a bit of an interactive map where you can actually look and search on the map the number of additions and the size. This is very small, and I apologize for how small the text is here. But the smallest dots on the map are additions worth about 30,000 Canadian dollars. The next size up is $100,000. The next bigger circle is 300, and then all the way to 1 million and over. So the size of the dot relates to the cost, but these are each individual renovations projects that have taken place in Toronto. And what you can do is toggle through year by year. So in 2001, we can see the number of permits. Here, I'll just do that. And if we go all the way to 2018, you can see how these geographies have changed. This to us is significant because it really does represent not only a growing number of permits, but really more expensive permits. So more expensive renovations. People are spending more on additions. They're undertaking more expensive additions. And this represents a vast circulation of capital through the downtown low-rise housing stock. But one of the great things about these maps, for me at least, is that you can look through and sort of see how the geographies of these additions have sort of changed. We see, for example, the growth in the spending on renovations, but you can also really see the changing geographies, and we'll point in a few minutes to this. So to my mind, this is really a different map of residential change than I have perhaps seen. Sorry. Part of it is that it's a debt map. So we might think of what Alan Walks and others have sort of mapped as a kind of debtscape by looking at mortgage debt. But what we see here as actually likely involves a secondary circuit of debt undertaken, particularly for those more expensive projects. We're talking about homeowners mining and dipping into the equity in their home to take out home equity lines of credit, so HELOCs, which we've seen grow very, very substantially. But they've also seen, for example, the refinancing of mortgages so that people can undertake these very large renovations. So this to me is, in a sense, an equity debtscape. It's an equity scape that shows us a different picture, I think, of neighborhood wealth than the mapping of, say, income wealth or the mapping of mortgage wealth. And what we're seeing is circuits of debt tapping into existing circuits of debt. And of course, as I've said here, this is also, I think, a bit of a picture of a labor market. This is the ways in which feminist and particularly Black feminist and third world feminist scholars have attuned us to the ways that housing, even as a fictitious commodity, is not simply a store of wealth. It is not, as David Harvey has sort of said, a kind of relatively stable addition to the landscape. It is a commodity that is highly dynamic and constantly reproduced through particular forms of paid and unpaid labor. And so one of the objectives of I think, the writing that we're doing now is to connect and suture together what we might think of as the primary circuit of commodity production and reproduction, together with these, with research on the financialization of housing and the incentives that Canadian home ownership and the political economy of home ownership incentivize homeowners to undertake. So I know we don't have a lot of time. Well, in the last couple of slides, we'll show you a little bit of the preliminary work that we're doing to think about this vis-a-vis gentrification. And again, it's still a bit of a question mark for us. Oh, but we also have this. Glenn, do you want to talk? Ugo, I hope it's okay for us to just spend about five, 6 more minutes on this, and then we'll open it up to questions. Is that okay?
Yes. Don't worry. We have time. Don't worry.
Okay, great. Glenn, go ahead.
Thanks, Michelle. I'll go really quickly through this. As Michelle talked about earlier, one of the things that I've been doing, and one of the reasons I was one of many reasons why I was interested in this project was because I saw it as an opportunity to create a data set which would allow me to get students out into the community and working with geographic information and interpreting geographic information in comparison to what those communities are actually like. So as she just showed you, we've got renovation data which spans the entire city. The Scarborough campus of U of T is a commuter campus. Some students travel a long way. They come from all over the city to get there. A lot are in the area immediately around the campus. So I'm interested in finding exercises where I can get students to do work on data in any part of the city. And this data set allows me to do that. So I won't spend much time on this, just very quickly going through this. Essentially what this has done is it's allowed me to start with this data set of renovations or new builds, because I have, one of the things I said to Michelle when we started this project was, we're never throwing any data away. So if we're not working with new buildings now, I'm keeping all the data for new buildings as well. So I can create a subset of these records, which covers the entire city of Toronto. I offer that to the students. Here's a bunch of residential renovation points. Pick some of these that are close to where you live, where you work, where you go to school, and create a data set which you're going to develop as part of your exercise over a couple of assignments. Next slide, Michelle. So they create a planning map like the one I'm showing now. And as part of that, this is what I did last year, although this ended up getting shut down by the pandemic. I told them to use Google Street View and see if they could find before and after images of the renovations that we had identified with our data set. And if they could find the before picture, they would capture the before picture off of Street View. Next picture, please. And then the second part of the assignment is they would go on site and they would collect a current photo of the place showing the difference in the renovation that had been carried out. But they would also do just small area observations. Are there other, so key questions are there other residential renovations that you can see in this area that actually don't show up in our data set? What does that mean? And then using this information, we can basically get the students collecting, in this case, qualitative data, pictures of an area, to basically create, in this case, we sort of built an aggregated multimedia map where students were inserting reflections as well as pictures of the areas now, was the original plan. I will do this maybe in 2 years after the pandemic calms down. But so this is an opportunity to get students thinking about space, connecting those spaces to abstract models like maps, and creating qualitative data as part of an online geographic information system. So to me, this is a really exciting project to put in front of first and second year students. And that was kind of what I saw when I first started thinking about how to get involved with this project. I'll leave it at that.
Wonderful, thanks, Glenn. So I'll go through in the last couple of minutes just a few of the other insights that we're chasing up at this moment. One is to actually think about this changing equity landscape against perhaps more conventional methods of mapping gentrification, which have largely been through principal components analyses of looking at changing demographics in particular neighborhoods, but also changing incomes. So Glenn has prepared these really fantastic maps of, here you see in 2000, the areas in green are the poor, in a sense, the lower income areas of Toronto. So you can see the middle of Toronto. This is Forest Hill. This is a very, very wealthy part of the city and still is Forest Hill, Mount Pleasant, and so on. And this western part here. But we see a vast swath, particularly in the sort of western part here and here, this U. And when we map the equity, the sort of renovations data onto this, if we fast forward, here we see the changing income. We see an enormous amount of rising incomes here. The brown parts, just very briefly, are showing you in a nutshell, the areas of the city that are getting richer. And if we overlay the income maps with what I would say are the equity maps, we see, not surprisingly, the very rich parts of town that have the income to source additional debt and to mine the equity in their home, unsurprisingly, have been the net beneficiaries of rising equity in housing prices, because they've been able to simply, in effect, take on more debt and invest in their homes in very, very substantial ways. But we've also seen neighborhoods like Weston Road and the Junction neighborhoods like the sort of the downtown west side, Leslieville, Dentonia Park, my neighborhood, and that's where I live, that have really been also net recipients of a lot of renovation. And it's those neighborhoods that we will now focus on to think about some of the implications for the changes, the concentration of the transformation of what is mostly a lot of low-rise post-war, particularly in this area, very small post-war houses that have received enormous amounts of change to the built envelope. So I will leave it there, and we'll open it up for a break and questions. But the other thing I just wanted to mention very quickly, which we can talk about in the questions perhaps, is the final thing we're looking at too, are the ways in which this amazing tool that Glenn has created, in which you can sort of focus in on neighborhoods and see different kinds of building permits, might be a tool for the public. So for example, we've been talking with anti-gentrification activists in Toronto about the kinds of information we might be able to visualize through a map like this. It might not be housing additions, but it could be, for example, all of the open permits for changes to rental housing that often are precursors to renoviction. So commercial landlords that renovate and then flip their building to attract more higher luxury clients. What kind of a visualizing tool might make this open data, which is public, more accessible? So I just wanted to thank Glenn for this really amazing tool. For me as a layperson, I think it actually has a lot of public applications that we're going to be looking into. So sorry for going over time, everyone. Thank you so much. And we welcome all of your questions and comments.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Michelle and Glenn. I think we can have just 4 or 5 minutes break, and we can start in at our time for 17, more or less.
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye. See you soon. Perhaps I gave too many minutes. We can start even a little bit earlier. How is the situation now with the epidemic in Toronto?
You're muted, Michelle.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, what was that, Ugo?
How is the situation with the pandemic now in your state?
It's not great in Toronto right now.
We've just been on a month of going backwards to stage 2, which has meant that, you know, gyms and restaurants have been closed because the numbers were spiking in October. So October basically saw us shut down again. So this Saturday, things are going to start opening back up again. But I'm not really sure. I mean, Italy had a second spike, didn't you?
Yeah, there is a second wave. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The number of people dying is increasing. It's growing.
Is it? Yeah.
Yeah, our numbers are still going up, despite the fact that the government is making noises that they're actually going to open things up again in a few days. Our numbers are actually still going up right now. So it doesn't look like a good decision to me. But
no. Yeah, I imagine that the government, where you are, is probably dealing with similar sort of pandemic fatigue, where there's decreasing kind of malleability of the public to really have, face another lockdown, particularly small business owners, and especially in Toronto. So we're one of the hot spots, unfortunately.
Yeah. Also here, I mean, during the first wave, Italians were quite brave in a way, and so there was even a sense of solidarity and commitment, to fight the pandemic. But now also the social and economic effects are very hard hitting.
I can only imagine. I mean, the footage
and small businesses, and so there is a lot of social rage across the country.
I can only imagine. It's such a difficult time right now. It is so. I mean, the footage though that we in North America saw, the solidarity in Italy was really touching and amazing. I mean, it was just incredible to see all of the, when we saw a lot of the footage of the balcony.
Yeah, and then there is the issue of public schools in Italy, because in many regions, local states, officially they should be open. In many local states, they had to close school because of.
They did they?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, that makes a lot of sense in a lot of ways. Our schools are open, but my children's school just had an outbreak, and it was in one classroom, and all they did was send that classroom home, and our kids are still going to school. So it's tenuous. It feels very tenuous.
Yeah, I mean, in most European countries, the biggest countries like Germany, France, and UK, they have managed to impose lockdowns, but to preserve schools from shutting down.
Yeah.
While in Italy, it seems that they've been less effective. They promised last summer to give priority to schools, to public school system, and to protect it. But in the end, it has proven to be illusory in many ways. So there is a lot of discontent amongst parents, and it's complicated.
It certainly is. It certainly is.
Because many parents want school open, and they are right to ask this, but at the same time, it's unclear whether schools are contagion hubs,
Indeed. Yeah.
It seems not, but still, it's complicated.
And in L'Aquila, is it a hotspot, or is it not considered to be?
Which one?
Where you are, is it a hotspot? Is it
well, I split my time between L'Aquila here and Naples. Yeah, Naples, it's complicated because of a weak hospital system. So
I
it's
see.
already been overloaded, but it's also in other regions, also in wealthier region of the most populated regions like that of Naples, of Milan, with big
Mhm.
metro areas. There is a lot of pressure on the hospitals.
Milan was very hard hit, wasn't it?
Yeah, and it's
Mm.
been hit hard again in
Oh,
this.
it has.
You know, most
Oh,
of people of deaths,
yeah.
fatality, they say, is happening again in the Lombardy region, the region of Milan. It's
Okay.
unclear why, but I mean,
Mhm.
the
Mhm.
demographic factor is one reason, but
Oh,
it's
wow.
unclear why. Okay, so I think we can restart.
Okay.
I don't know if you need a few minutes to conclude or you have done.
I think we'll leave it there just because of time. Yeah.
Okay,
Mhm.
great. So, um,
Looks like there's some questions from Margarita and Sarah.
yeah,
So,
exactly. Margarita and Sarah, they've both raised their hands, so I can give the floor to Margarita first and then to Sarah. Thanks.
oh, you're muted.
Okay, you should hear me now.
Yes.
So thanks a lot for your great presentation, Michelle and Glenn. It was extremely interesting and it made me think a lot of comparison with the Italian case and Rome's in particular. So I would like to ask you some questions that relate with this kind of comparison. So first of all, I think that, I mean, this idea of assets-based welfare is extremely important. And for me, it was also something new to hear this about Canada and let's say what we could call the American continent, because this discussion about the importance of homeownership is usually referred to Southern European countries, especially in the guise of intergenerational transmission of wealth. So my question would be how much intergenerational transmission of housing is important, or is it just based, let's say, on a mono-generation household as a form of wealth? So that would be my first one.
Mhm.
As you wish, I may leave the other questions for later or ask you all the questions as you wish.
Up to the moderators. I'm happy to go either way, whatever makes sense.
Yeah, please, Margarita, go ahead. So
Okay.
they can collect the.
Okay, thank you, Ugo. And the other one would be about the relation of these renovation plans and also of the surge of housing prices in relation to bigger renovation and rebranding plans. Because, for instance, in Rome, many times the surge, especially rental prices, is not related to single houses renovation, but actually it depends from bigger redevelopment plan or the presence of infrastructures. For instance, in the eastern quadrant of Rome, a lot of, let's say, gentrification related phenomena came from the new installation of the tube, the line C of the tube. Mm-hmm. And many of the houses were not renovated because this type of renovation, coupled with a sort of rebranding where the fact that houses would be decadent, old, or shaped in a certain way, would be considered as something, let's say, shabby chic, or constructing a sort of urban exotic brand, if we could say so. So that would be my second question, actually. And my third is kind of related to this, because many times alongside this kind of infrastructure, touristification comes. So I was wondering if you had the chance to track down how many of these houses that were renovated were not actually intended for the household living, but redirected towards platform economies like Airbnb and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. Thanks very much.
Mm-hmm. Margarita, thank you for those excellent questions. Those are absolutely spot on. Glenn, do you want me to take the first round of this, or do you want to chime in, or?
Yes, perhaps you can start answering this question.
Yeah, I mean, to your first question, the question of the intergenerational transfer of wealth, I think, is an absolutely crucial one. And I want to point to the work of, there are a host of scholars who are doing that work, and we're not doing that work. So a scholar by the name of Nancy Worth has been doing some really interesting, really crucial work on millennial opportunities for homeownership. But also, so many younger people in Toronto moving back to live with their parents, right? And she characterizes this very much as a form of privilege, in fact, because if you have a home that's big enough, but in fact, that is one of the principal ways that younger homeowners or new homeowners, like people on the property ladder for the first time, absolutely intergenerational wealth, especially to afford the down payment. If you think about, there are rules now in the Canadian home market, in part to sort of quell what was just an exploding housing market. They said that you have to have a 20% down payment. Otherwise, you have to get insurance. Because the other thing that the government is very worried about is that that there's a crash and then multiple people start to foreclose on their homes. But what this has done is it has changed, in effect, the goalposts for the property class. And the way that people are getting through that is to bank, the bank of mom and dad. So Nancy's work is very important in that respect. And there are other housing scholars who are doing that work that would probably be very important. But you're absolutely right. It's one of the chief ways that class is intergenerational, right? Very much in this moment.
And the equity-based bank of mom and dad has been expanded partly through renovations, which increase the perceived value of their asset so that they can then draw more debt on that.
Yeah.
So there's all sorts of interesting circulations here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And to your second question on infrastructure, and if I understand your question, you were sort of thinking, there are other things that fuel and drive gentrification, and you're absolutely right. So what we're not arguing here is somehow that renovations are themselves a kind of primary nexus. I mean, they are in a lot of cases, but I think where we're almost going with this research is to say that this fuels gentrification, but it may not be fostered through gentrification. It may be fostered through these kinds of asset welfare incentives and the dynamics of housing prices. So we've seen in multiple parts of the downtown, and there are scholars like Martine August, Catherine Rankin, Heather McLean, a whole host of urban scholars. We have a whole affordable housing, Julie Ma, different really incredible scholars working in Toronto and on Toronto who have looked at key infrastructure projects like the light rail lines. So for example, there's been amazing downtown amenities, including a bikeable, they've turned old rail lines into bikeable and walkable structures. There's vast research on the sort of repurposing of industrial and institutional transit yards into these sort of arts-based hubs. Their work has really looked at the ways in which that, more than anything, right now there's Eglinton West, which is Little Jamaica in Toronto, is the site of a huge infrastructural project of light rail. And of course, what we're seeing is that businesses there are very much struggling under the infrastructural, it's just a huge construction site right now. So they're really struggling, but the people are being displaced very much and are also banding together to resist and also sort of recoup space and demand benefits from that infrastructural investment. So there's been a whole movement around that as well. But I think what we want to point to is that there are layers of, and sort of almost like a kind of offshoot circuitry from rising housing prices that further exacerbate these other kinds of drivers of gentrification. And one of them is the home renovations industry. And the government has been very, very supportive. If we think of low interest rates, they're not just so people can afford their homes and don't have to foreclose on their homes. that is, to my mind, employment policy. The home is an investable asset in the renovations industry. And so those low interest rates are not simply for homeowners, they're actually for workers. Oh, and then owner occupier. I would love to see that data. And I think you're probably right. There may be a whole host of people who are renovating so that they can then rent out their primary residence. There are rules in Toronto now that you have, although there are tons of ghost hotels that don't adhere to those rules. One of the things that we've been looking at and talking to our colleague Steve Farber is he has a very large data set on housing resales. And we've always suspected that there's a large commercial piece here, but we've never been able to get the data. So one of our next projects may, I don't know, I'm not sure, Glenn, we'll have to talk about this, but maybe combining some of the data sets that we've made with theirs to actually understand who's a home, who's a commercial house flipper and who's an owner occupier. Because I think that would be, I speculate that is a very large portion of what we're seeing here.
With the data set that we're working with right now, we don't actually see that, because although the original permit records, the original building permits would have certainly contained information about the applicant, who is applying for this and who is carrying out this work. That's been stripped out of the data set that has been posted publicly. So we see the information about the project that was carried out, but we don't see kind of who was behind the project.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for your answers. Sarah, she wants to make a question.
Actually, my questions were quite close to the one of Margherita, so I just probably ask you again the same issues, adding some points. First of all, thank you for your inspiring talk. The research is really rigorous, and also the interactive tool is quite useful also for further analysis, and also on gentrification, but also, as you said, on the housing market dynamic. Because what I was thinking while you were talking and illustrating your map is that it would be interesting to see how many of these houses were actually still used by the same homeowner that started those renovations, or how many of these were actually into the rental markets. Because as you said, the city has not, the residential change happened during the 2009, 2018, if I don't remember wrong, your map or your graph. But it was interesting about also the amount of people using these new renovation and new houses, if these are actually addition, so the house is getting bigger, or if these are actually division of the same house into two houses.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think this is interesting because it's adding actually new housing to the city, even though it's expensive, or let's say if it's actually directing only to a specific population, but actually it's adding housing into the housing market. So I was interested in this housing market dynamic, if you are actually analyzing the dynamic of the market, not only of the rental market, but also on the market of housing in general. And the other question was about illegality, let's say. As you said, there's a huge movement around these renovations. And as Glenn shown us in those code, sometimes it's not clear if there's an additional square meter, if the housing are getting bigger or not, even though the renovation seems to follow that direction. So is this a sort of illegal way of adding space, or do you think it's just an error, or let's say a mistake into this code? Last but not least is about the let's say the displacement and exclusion that this kind of huge renovation movement might open, because you are dealing with gentrification. But I think that probably most of these renovation are actually displacing or excluding certain portions of the population. It's not about changing, as you said, the demographics or the income of people living there, because probably they are still the homeowners living in those houses, but probably the changes are into the exclusion of certain kind of population from the rental market that are moving from certain neighborhoods to others because of the high costs of the housing prices. So these are my overall question for now. But again, thank you. It was really interesting, and also the interactive tool is, I think it's inspiring from many points of view, and I think it might open new mapping and new methodologies on residential gentrification, because I agree with you that we cannot map gentrification only by mapping the income, the changing in the incomes, but also what Margherita said at the beginning about the role of other indicators, such as public investment in not only in, let's say, transit-oriented neighborhoods, but also on public space, on certain kind of services. I think this is a way of mapping that can be let's say, uploaded to your, or let's say, overlapped to your map to show how gentrification is actually happening in that neighborhood.
Thank you for that. Glenn, did you want to start, or shall I?
I can start with just a couple of comments about the first question.
Sure.
The question about whether or not the same homeowners are using the space as instigating the renovations. We haven't looked at this too much yet, but the data set we do have for each project independently tracks whether or not the residential living space was increased, which I talked about, but it also does track whether or not the number of dwelling units has been increased. So in some of the records, we do see that, yes, there is an addition of one dwelling unit. So, and that could be all kinds of things. So it could be somebody creating a rental space. It could be somebody building a separate space for extended family. And we don't have visibility of what that purpose is right now, but we do have some data there that indicates that the dwelling units have been increased in some of these. So it's a surprisingly small number where that actually is tagged. And I think just to jump ahead to sort of your third question as well, or actually your second question, how much of this real activity is actually covered by the data we have? And there we have good reason to believe that certainly in the suburban areas, we believe there is work that's going on that is not covered by permits, where people are converting an existing residence into a rooming house or whatever, a multi-unit rental close to university campuses that might happen, things like that. And so we suspect that there's a fair amount of that that's not covered by this data, but that's hard to put our fingers on right now.
Indeed. So thanks, Sarah, for these questions. I mean, one of the most wonderful things, we've only given 2 talks so far, this one and one to our own colleagues at U of T about this new research, is the wonderful ideas that you just gave in terms of that Margherita gave around the possible opportunities for layering of this research, and to think about it vis-a-vis other sort of physical marks changes to the built structure, right, in terms of infrastructure. I think that's brilliant. And we had had similar really interesting conversations with our colleagues at the School of Cities at U of T. And I do think that, I think one of the things is we want to make this tool kind of public for the general public, is that some of the data that we've captured also could then be taken by our colleagues by that we can allow this to be a kind of tool and a sort of data set that gentrification scholars can use in their own research. So I think that's really exciting in that respect. And it was interesting just to on your first question, Glenn has been talking about it's very difficult to overstate the acute nature of the affordability crisis here in Toronto. And one of our own team members, an awesome, amazing student, as we were going through and trying to code these, had said, "Oh, I don't think they would mind me telling the story. I just went to try and find a room to rent. Somebody has enclosed their sunroom and is renting out that room." And that kind of division, like literally, it's basically an outside porch that's probably been covered in glass potentially, or plywood, and that is becoming a kind of income generating, as people try to find places to rent that are affordable. That's what people are looking at. But that kind of division of sort of the renting out of rooms, I don't think also would show up. And I do think that there are ethical questions for us about, because we had sort of had discussions about that division of larger houses and the conversion of larger houses into smaller houses. I'm not sure that that's something I would want to make visible, because it is in part about survival for a lot of people and finding a place to rent. So I think there's a whole invisible set of geographies here that we as researchers have to tread carefully around whether we want to. I think it would be like, empirically, I really want to know about this, but I'm not sure that it would be a road that will go down. But I do think you raise a really crucial question about the division. In terms of adding space, and you were asking about, and I guess that gets to your question about sort of illegality of adding space. I'm very curious. I think we're still trying to work through where that non-addition of space is. I think we've also been trying to parse, when we look at underpinnings, for example, the city of Toronto doesn't see that, and neither do permit appliers. They don't characterize that as the addition of space. So even that doubling of renovations that we showed you is actually a very partial picture. It doesn't actually show you the sheer number of new floors that are actually being created through basement finishings, but through all of the other, there's probably about 5,000 other permits that were not part of that graph, because they don't show an addition of space, but they actually are effectively somebody adding a new floor to their house. Is that correct, Glenn?
Yeah, so with the records that Michelle showed in that graph earlier, there are about another 4,500 projects where it looks to us like an addition, but the residential space value is 0. So in that particular graph, we were leaving those out. And this is actually one of the next conversations Michelle and I are going to have is when we start plotting numbers of projects in areas against the changes in income and some of these other things that we want to compare that against. Which numbers are we using? Are we using the ones that actually say they increase the living space, or are we using the ones that qualitatively we believe increase the living space? Mm-hmm. And so again, this comes down to a matter of how we try to interpret this data a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the general gist of our arguments in the paper that we're going to write is going to be that the 10,000 houses that have been added that we can actually see in the permit data are a, let's say, pun intended, a foundation, not a roof. They're the least amount of space that has been added, not the most. But I think all your questions are very, very spot on. Yeah, thank you. I don't know if that answer. I hope that answers them adequately.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your replies. There is one question from the audience. Rebecca Caviccia, please. Okay.
Fabiano as well.
Yeah, and Fabiano Compagnucci.
Yeah.
Fabiano, please.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Glenn, for your very interesting and timely presentation. I have just a curiosity, a general curiosity about your opinion, your point about the relationship, the potential relationship between the outcomes of COVID pandemic and I'm going to say the outcome in terms of gentrification process. I'm asking this question because we know that one of the main important outcome of the pandemic period was the smart working. So basically we are reflecting about the territorial, let's say, outcomes of this kind of process. Do you think that a lot of people think that the COVID will become structural within our society, meaning that maybe we must learn to live with it. So maybe also the structural effect in terms of smart working will affect our society in the future. And I was also wondering if smart working could become a public policy in order to lower the real estate pressure within cities. So it's just to know which is your point about this ongoing process in your city. Also because I imagine that Toronto, since it's a large city, is service oriented, high level service oriented, and so maybe people are allowed to, I'm going to say, to leave their homes and then go to work just for 1 day a week and be more free over the territory. So also to choose the location far from city center, downtown. That's my point. I would like your opinion.
Excellent. That's what a fabulous and timely question. Glenn, did you want to chime in or shall I?
I could chime in with all kinds of speculations. So just to tell you a story. So we've just had our Halloween here in Canada, and in the lead up to Halloween, there was all kinds of social discussions going on about whether or not we should allow children to go door to door trick-or-treating for Halloween. And this really already started to break down as kind of a class discussion, because some people were saying, well, of course we allow the children to go out and go door to door trick-or-treating. It's an outside activity, which is exactly the kinds of things that we've been told by public health to do. Exercise outside, stay away from people. So that was one side of the discussion. The other side of the discussion was all sorts of people who were pointing out, well, yes, but in Toronto, there's a huge population that lives in condominium buildings, apartment buildings. If people are going trick-or-treating, they're going from one apartment to the other inside a building. So a very much discussion that broke down along class lines already in terms of having this outside individual building with space around it versus being in these much more high density sort of living spaces. So I absolutely believe that COVID is actually going to drive a bunch of structural change in living preferences, travel preferences. People are scared to go on public transit. Working, yeah, if I'm supposed to teach courses online for the next 5 years, why am I living in Toronto?
Yeah.
So I think there's a whole bunch of stuff that could come out of this. That's a great question.
And I think we've already, sorry, go ahead. I think we are seeing some of exactly those kinds of dynamics. So we've seen early signs that, non-end user investors in the condominium market are fleeing right now in Toronto. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see quite a correction in the condominium market. And I do think it's important in this moment, particularly to disaggregate the housing market into those markets because they are so separate, they are discrete. During the pandemic, renovations workers were considered essential workers. And so all of that work happened and kept, because it keeps the economy going and it's a crucial part of the economy, but also people stuck at home started to undertake their own sort of home projects. And so we saw that very much that was very much a COVID piece. I wouldn't be surprised if we see increasing renovations for people to create their own home offices, right? So I think that has been a huge part of, especially working families with children at home and having no space. We may see much more of that. But one of the things that is happening right now among home building lobbyists, like the lobby groups that represent very large corporate homeowner or home builder companies, but also organized and higher end segments of the rental market, is they're calling for a just transition which focuses and centers the recovery on construction. Because they say so again, we see this kind of employment policy piece here that's not simply about living preferences, but actually about very heavy lobbying saying we need to reinstitute a tax for a renovation tax credit so we keep people investing in their homes. We need to make sure that we're that we're scrapping land transfer taxes, which was a huge tax that you have to pay if you're exchanging homes. And they say, what we want now is more home buying. What we want now is more home investment. So there's a very concerted push specifically around justified by or as they're trying to justify through COVID, to get the government to further loosen the kinds of things that would allow people, homeowners basically, to benefit. So I think that's a very salient question on a host of fronts, not simply on where people choose to live. I think that's one very crucial part of it, but I think there's an array of questions there that will be important to keep track of. Yeah, so thank you. I don't know if that answers very much. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Fabiano, and thanks for your answers. Rebecca Cavicchia?
Yes, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, thanks for the presentation. I think it was amazing and really inspiring, especially the maps were really great. And I'm myself studying gentrification in Oslo and working with this displacement pressure in particular. And I don't know if it can be useful for you or if you're already aware of that, but I could see that in some American cities, especially Chicago and LA, they have this interactive tools, interactive map, mapping susceptibility of gentrification and pressure of displacement. And looking at your maps, I was thinking that it could be amazing to create a multi-layered map where this building private renovation is an indicator of possible pressure of displacement. I don't know if you talked already about that. And then a question would be, because from the maps, I could see that, I mean, we saw them briefly, but the geographical distribution of this renovation areas is a bit scattered. So you can see some agglomeration along the coast and in some areas, but it's also quite spread in the city. And I was wondering if you have noticed in some of these areas also other kind of neighborhood changes, in physical changes, like increasing public investment in some specific areas where this renovation has produced maybe higher neighbor quality, if that makes sense. Yeah. This.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. I think these are all such wonderful questions, and I love that you mentioned those maps, because we were looking very much in talking with anti-gentrification scholars in the southwest of Toronto, are very organized and very doing a lot of research on their own and know their neighborhood so well. They know exactly which houses are being converted. They know exactly the risk of particular rental buildings to eviction, et cetera. They know far more than we do. And they had shown us, the New York map, which has identified partly through building permits, but other kinds of public data, which rental buildings are actually under threat. And so it's probably quite similar. I'd love to see the LA and the other maps. Maybe we can chat, or you can send me an email, we can connect.
Yeah.
I think we're very much using those as a potential model, because I think, those maps are much more user-friendly for just members of the public who may not be able to sift through 500,000 building permits that are an Excel file. Like that's not actually not accessible at all. But the idea of layering those with other particular kind of inputs, and I'm not sure whether that's the work that, I think whatever we do, we would like, there are gentrification scholars working in Toronto, both activists and scholars who've been doing this work for years. And so it's really their lead, the people working in particular neighborhoods who we hope, if we can connect with them, will be able to tell us what kind of a tool they need. And that scholars can also say, oh, here's what I would layer on it. So I think that what we would want to do is to learn from both the models that are out there and the best practices that are out there, but also from people on the ground, because from some people they've said, this is really interesting, but I already know this is happening. I don't need a map necessarily. But there are other neighborhoods that might need one, or that might need different information. So we would take our lead, I think, very much from them for sure. So I'd love to connect with you and just see what maps you have, and also hear more about your work.
I think there is some problem in the
Yes.
connection of Michelle.
Just one quick comment I'd add as well, Rebecca. Thanks for the question. It's interesting that you
Glenn, do you have
point out
a
couple of American cities that have produced these gentrification
Oops,
maps.
I think I froze there, did I? Oh.
Yeah, you did freeze up a bit there, Michelle.
Yeah.
Just to add a quick comment.
Sorry, did I cut out or did you hear the?
You
No,
cut out a little bit if you had something to finish up with.
Please go ahead. Yeah.
Rebecca, the American cities that you mentioned for this gentrification map is interesting. In some cases, there are differences between Canada and the States in terms of the types of open data that are available. Toronto does quite well. We have a pretty good group at the City Hall who are quite keen to push out open data that we can use for a variety of purposes. And it's British Columbia might be the other sort of precinct in Canada that does a really good job with its open data. But in general, it's far easier to find public data in the States than it is in Canada. So sometimes we're just hampered based on what types of data are actually available to us as well. So as Michelle said, we are sort of connecting with some people who are looking at gentrification, and we're sort of asking them, how could the data that we're working with necessarily connect to some of those discussions? But we're kind of taking the lead there from them. But yeah, I'd love to hear more about some of the examples that you've been looking at as well, Rebecca. That was a great question.
Yeah, I'll be happy to share some things.
Thank you.
Thanks for the answers also.
Thanks for your question, and thanks to the panel, to the speakers for their answers. We have one more question that is been written by Rahul Bandara from the audience. He asked how the permit to ask to increase the house size is done, whether residents ask it collectively, or people apply for the permit individually. Who is the agency here who does the job of a negotiation to increase in space of a house? Is it clear?
Mm-hmm. I think so. I can start, I guess. The permit application is absolutely individuated. So it really does come either from the contractor who's undertaking the work on behalf of the property owner, or the property owner themselves. And if they wanted to put an addition on the top floor and the street is not zoned for that, then they would actually have to go through a public process of asking for that additional height, like basically a minor amendment to the zoning. And they would have to go through a process called Committee of Adjustment. That is a public process where neighbors are allowed to chime in. And as you can imagine, that can sometimes be an easy process, and sometimes it can be very fraught on the neighborhood. But it really does, it is a very individual process. But often once one house has, what they'll often do in Committee of Adjustment, if somebody else has managed to create an addition and has already gotten an allowance, it then becomes very difficult for anyone else, for the committee to refuse anyone else from doing the same. So our zoning here works very much on precedent in a lot of cases. And I can look on my own street to see, there's a 4-story home down the street for me, and I'm not sure how they got clearance to do that, but it does sort of set the stage for other kinds of renovation to take place on that street. I don't know if that gets to the question. If I've misunderstood it, let me know.
Thanks, Michelle. Glenn, do you have anything to add on this issue?
No, I think I'll leave it. Yeah. Michelle's answer was good. I'll leave it with that.
Yeah, I'm not sure if there are other questions. Personally, I'm curious about perhaps it's an obvious question about the effects of the pandemic and the related social distancing measures what you're studying, because this kind of pandemic and the economic crisis that has caused, it's different from the previous financial crisis, because also these stay-home orders. This might, and also you mentioned, Glenn, the fact that smart remote working may lead many people to go to the suburbs or to other smaller towns and so on. At the same time, those who are wealthy enough to own a house in downtown or in central Toronto, they might be motivated to enlarge their houses because they stay home. We are spending more time at home, so housing is even more valued. In this crisis, the house prices are not decreasing, but they might be even grow and go up because of this more value we give to a house. So is there any evidence about home renovations going on because of this added value, this more value given by the stay-home orders to housing? Does it make sense?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That is an excellent question. I don't know the answer because I feel like that's almost terrain shifting under our feet in real time, But I think what your question points to is probably that, yes, it probably will. In what ways, I'm not sure. I mean, the one thing that we do know is that renovations have buoyed the economy over the pandemic because they've been regulated to be able to do so, that those workers have been able to continue their work. That it certainly has kept a pace and in fact outstripped the sort of the fall in the economy in other sectors. So I don't know what evidence there might be out there. I'd be curious to think through how you would get at that data, because it gets into almost a kind of granular homeowner. Like, one of the things that Glenn and I haven't done is to simply sit down with homeowners and do a survey about why they're undertaking the renovations. Some of that data is available through the committee of adjustment data. There's data sets on why people undertake those big renovations. But they won't show exactly what you're asking, which is, if I understand it, how COVID is really almost shifting the sort of feelings of security and investment in the home. That's sort of what you're getting at, Ugo, I think. Would you say? I'm afraid I have to say I don't know. But I think that's an excellent, excellent question. Glenn, I don't know if you have any insight to share on that.
Well, yeah, it is a great question. So the data that we've looked at, we only looked up until 2018. So we sort of stopped looking before the pandemic. So there is 2019 data, which we would be able to go back and look at now. That's still too early. But in addition to all these data files that the city makes available for all the cleared permits, the ones that have been completed, the city does actually have an online feed of all the open permits as well. So you might be able to actually look at that data and try to parse to see whether or not there has been an application surge since late 2019. In which case you might see some of that. I expect there's actually a couple of different types of impulses here. One is the addition of space. Absolutely, anecdotally, I've had discussions with people who are saying, last 7 months have shown me that my house is just too small. So you do hear people talking about that anecdotally. So increasing space for a family home, I would expect that you might actually see a counterbalancing where there's a lot less work going into actually subdividing an existing space to create rentals, because nobody's clear right now what that market is going to look like 5 months from now. And so people might be hesitant to do those kinds of projects.
Indeed.
That's a great question.
Thank you for your answers, and it's been great to have you here, even though only virtually, and perhaps at some point you will be able to visit the Grand Sasso Science Institute and our city of L'Aquila. So many thanks again, Glenn and Michelle, and we can stop here as planned at 5, so we are very on time.
I'm sure. Thank you so much, and everyone. And if anyone would like to get in touch with us, please do send us an email. We'd love to hear from you. So thank you to everyone, and thank you, Ugo and Margarita, and everyone at the Institute.
Yes, thanks for the invitation. Thanks for all the great questions.
Have a good evening, everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Okay.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.